Hi, I'm Dr. Margot Hurlbert. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change, Energy, and Sustainability, and I'm speaking today on what is deliberative public engagement. I want to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis. I'm going to speak a little bit about what is engagement, why it is needed in this era of polarization and distrust. I'll speak a bit about policy framing, engagement, social learning, why engagement is needed, and how to engage. So the problem we have to address today is this ongoing debate about whether policy problems should be addressed technocratically or whether they should be the subject of politicization and public engagement. Sometimes you hear that word that we should make evidence-based policy decisions. Sometimes it's based on technocratic decision making. So here we're going to talk a bit and think a bit today on politicization and problem solving. When's public participation needed and when is it not necessary? So my background is on climate change and technology and power production. So I've been fascinated on how we're going to address climate change. So many of my examples today come from that field and work that I've done with the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, the WMO, about addressing the policy gap on getting our emissions to net zero. So my work started in Saskatchewan, where I'm based, and back in 2005, when I started this work, climate change in rural Saskatchewan didn't engage people and farmers particularly in discussion. So policy framing is a crucial aspect of engaging with people on the policy problems that they're interested in. So drought and flood spoke to agricultural producers, but climate change did not. So drought and flood are sub-policy problems, connected policy problems to the bigger policy problem of adapting to climate change. In another completely different area, nuclear technology, which is part potentially of the solution of power production to achieve net zero, has some very similar policy framing issues around, first of all, nuclear energy, but also radiation exposure. So breaking policy problems down into sub-policy problems and engaging on, instead of the big complex policy problem all of the time, but the sub-policy problems, is a way to think about public engagement in policy making. So I came up with this split ladder of participation as a mechanism for thinking about how to engage with people. In the bottom right-hand corner are structured policy problems that don't have uncertainty in either people's value systems or in the science. So climate change has uncertainty in the science and people's values about how to adapt or to reduce emissions. So it's the opposite of the structured policy problem. It's a complex, wicked problem in the top left-hand corner of this split ladder. But structured problems like not using toxic chemicals like DDT, those decisions have been made historically. They're in our regulations. There's no need to engage with people and revisit those structured decisions where the science is clear and the values have been ascertained. So the split ladder is a build on from a very ancient 1969 ladder of participation of Einstein, which romanticized participation, where citizens should always be engaged, kind of in the old Greek sense of public engagement, of every decision made by the body politic being engaged with the public. And we know that's not the case. So the 1969 ladder you're seeing, if there wasn't public participation, it was tended to be viewed as manipulation or therapy. But if there was participation, it was completely citizens' control. So the split ladder tries to correct this Einstein's ladder that's been used a lot in thought around public participation, and recognize that that we build people's trust, but if we do something that is not trustful to them, if they feel that we are being paid by the nuclear industry, then they will distrust what we say. So we want to build people's trust in our engagement, but not have that cliff edge of losing people's trust. So that's where the split ladder idea about policy framing and using participation where necessary and how necessary came into being. Because solving climate change is a complex problem, but engaging with people solely on that wicked, complex problem of climate change isn't necessarily in their interests, and increasingly in our polarized world, not something that people are interested in engaging on. So we break our policy problems into smaller components to engage with people based on their interest, their time. And keeping in mind there's a window of opportunity when policy can be changed and structural social learning can happen, and it's not always open. So sometimes the window of opportunity is open, whether because our politicians have opened up the space for legislation or regulation change, or there's been an election, or policy entrepreneurs, the groups that are striving for making environmental change have opened up the discursive space. And sometimes that policy window isn't opened. So we want to consider that when we're thinking about where to engage in these complex problems. Initially, when the split ladder was created, Einstein's manipulation and therapy in the bottom left-hand corner was somewhere where we as engagement specialists didn't want to be, where we were in therapy, manipulation, or placation. But that actually has changed with the new visioning of the split ladder of participation, where sometimes we have to attract interest in policy problems. So we're using social and behavioral science in order to attract interest in people to engage in, whether it's low dose radiation that they get in their x-rays and their health field, and how that relates to the regulations we have around radiation exposure, in order to make new policies and regulations around the new Generation 4 small modular nuclear reactors that are being considered by Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario at this time, and is potentially could be polarizing in the future. So opening up the climate discussion innovation space through public participation, it's an art and a science. And we don't want to be too theoretical, but thinking about the theory and how people's values and how the science and uncertainty is reflected in our media and in people's space of engagement and who we're engaging with allows us to think about why we're doing engagement, why we're trying to increase levels of trust with people, and where we need to shift norms and have some energy decisions made and policy decisions made into the future. So from my slides, I want you to take the message that we're not romanticizing participation, but in today's world of polarization, it's necessary to think about strategically how we are informing people and having their input into our policy and our policy changes, and how experts technocratically can advise on policy, but there's an interesting relationship between experts, policymakers, and people's input into those policy. So part of the issue around polarization is what I call a paradox. And from this, it's something that the language of engagement makes sound good or sound secure, but actually means something very different to people when they hear it. And so just examples of this is inherently safe. When you use those words to the public, it means something really good. and really engaging with them. But actually, in the engineering world, inherently safe has a very specific meaning that's quite different from what the public say. So we want to think about that and not fall into that trap of losing trust because we've been engaging and using some words coming from engineering that actually don't mean what the public is hearing them say. So a policy paradox is where we're actually using those words in politics that have multiple meanings and where they resonate with people but mean something very different to the people that are hearing them. So this is kind of the danger zone on where we don't want to be engaging because we potentially fall into a trap of being caught into that paradox, politicization, and lose trust of the people that we're engaging with in policy. So politicization and participation and this idea about how to engage can both be used to assess how we've engaged in the past, but also to create a strategy of how we're going to engage into the future based on that uncertainty of science, but also on that uncertainty of social science or the values that people have in relation to a topic such as climate change or something equally complex or with multiple meanings. So the new split ladder of participation actually took all of the times the split ladder was used by academics or people publishing it and recognizes that those wicked, complex top left-hand problems is where we want the debate to happen. And where we want to move people is into the social learning, where we as people learn together by listening and hearing one another and engaging in interdisciplinary science. And if we have enough engagement, we can actually move policy problems into that structured where we agree on values, we agree there's a consensus, and that's not 100% on the science, and we write regulations, make policy, and take decisions. So it's that constant kind of interaction. And one way I talked at the beginning about radiation that we've experimented with is in using dose and perspective with natural radiation around us. And we've thought about how do we attract interest, because most people aren't interested in learning about radiation, and engaging with science fiction and the humanities and creation of an atomic Eve as a way to engage with people, spark interest, not placate or manipulate, but start a discussion around some of these issues. Also, thinking about inclusive voices where we talk to people about climate change and we used all of the concerns we heard without excluding any of the concerns is a methodology. So in conclusion, stakeholder participation, politicization don't in themselves guarantee minority rights or the right of nature will be protected. And that's why constitutions are so important, and we have constitutions. So what I want to make very clear is that the duty to consult and the rights of Indigenous people are protected by constitutions. And so those engagements are something that are constitutionally protected, and we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that when I'm talking about engagement and the split ladder, that somehow overrides the Indigenous and the constitutional obligations of consultation and free prior informed consent. Okay. So remembering that is key. And as policymakers, also knowing that public judgment is really where we want to be, not a public opinion. But in public judgment, we've got we've got an emphasis on values and ethics. It's a place where we recognize that consensus doesn't mean 100%. There will always be opponents to complex problems and their solutions, but having a fair weighing of alternatives, a good discursive space is where, as communicators, as engagement people, we would like our outcomes to be. So we have some goals and some objectives when we think about public judgment versus that public opinion that we often get into that trap. So thank you for the opportunity to present. There's some references here if you want to delve further into any of this information. So the split ladder is set to function in a democracy where people's engagement in policy and policy making is valued and important, but recognizing that we elect political leaders who make decisions in our delegated voting patterns. So it's unrealistic to expect that every single decision is made with the participation of people. And that's why we have structured policy problems where they're based on evidence, the values are somewhat set, and politicians make decisions, pass legislation, regulation, and policy, and effect it without public participation. I love this question because I really don't think there's one government that gets this right all the time and always, right? So from my perspective, thinking about the split ladder just as a way of thinking about when and how to engage allows us to build a strategy or a plan into the future and think about that social learning and the differences in science, but also values and why we're engaging and what our outcomes are looking like. So I don't think, even myself, when I do a lab experiment in this, you never get it right at the beginning, and nor do governments. So I do think that some governments have done better, perhaps, and I have to use climate change as my example. So some of the Northern European governments have thought about climate change. Since the time when we had gas shortages in the 1970s, they've been worried about excess energy reliance, and just that was a policy problem that related to the climate change problem. So they started addressing it back in the 1970s, right? So, but that's one topic, one problem, and one example. So I don't think that there's a government who's a leader in public participation. I think different governments have had very good experience and done some great things with public participation, depending on the policy problem. But that's also why policy mixes are really important to think about, and not one single policy in isolation. Well, from my perspective, it's climate change. Like the fires that have happened, the flooding and the droughts that we've been having here in the prairie provinces in the last 4 and 5 years really bring this to the fore, as well as some of the hurricanes that are happening in the United States. And then the other area, which is not my area, that might be qualifying for a complex problem is that of healthcare. So those, in my opinion, I'm sure there's more. So I'm going to use a Saskatchewan example. And in Saskatchewan, we had command and control environmental regulations like maybe 10 years ago. And they really weren't working, partly because we couldn't afford to have all of the people necessary to go out and enforce environmental regulations. So there was a movement to results-based regulation, and it took a long time. There were lots of consultations in order to bring about the legislation and then the regulations and have very specific ways of doing it. So no one was happy. So again, it's an example where you had public judgment as opposed to public opinion, but it was a change that had to happen, and a lot of social learning of environmental groups and governments government bureaucrats, happened during the process, which was quite long. I'm sure there's other examples provincially and federally as well. Yeah, first of all, participation, it's more than just a job for public servants, really. It's an ecosystem. So academics, think tanks, civil society organizations, they all engage in a bit of participation. And I think thinking about it that way and learning from one another is really important. There's also a science around social learning and engagement. And as an academic, I am not advocating a particular policy for climate change, but I'm really creating a laboratory where people can think about what's working in responding to droughts or floods and what isn't working, what works for engaging people in a discussion and talking about something like nuclear or mining lithium or mining uranium in Saskatchewan, and what it would take in order to address concerns and what they would advise in order to do that. So it's really a deeper science than consultant communicators. And I think thinking about that too is important. And then the third one is our survey work shows that scientists are trusted communicators. In government, we have government scientists, industry, and academia. So again, working together on solving these complex problems, which aren't going to happen overnight, is really important. And I think those scientists help prevent that toxic environment that can happen when we disagree on certain issues.